I'm really excited about our conversation today. Sanford Biggers and Helen Molesworth. Helen is the new curator and resident of the ranch. You're going to see a lot of her introducing programs and helping us this summer. We're really excited to have her on staff. So before we get started, I want to quickly thank the Lewis family. Toby Lewis has been an underwriter of this series since it began. It's really important support we get. Mel and Adam are here representing Toby, so thank you for being here. Oh, and Jonathan snuck in, sorry. So thank you for coming. And I wanted to thank Dennis Scholl. Ulight Arts is an underwriter of the series as well, and we're really thrilled to have them here. A lot of the series underwriters are in the room. If you just raise your hand quick, because if I name you all, we won't hear a conversation. But thank you for making this series possible. And clearly, our media sponsors are really helpful in keeping the word out and getting those things going. Most of all, I really want to thank those of you who are members of the Anderson Ranch. Our National Council really drives our success. And any of you who are not, you're sure welcome to join, and Hannah will help you out outside the door. But please get involved. There are a lot of great events, and as a member, you really get to know and see what those are firsthand. So thank all of you for coming on that. Lastly, I wanted to thank Ann Cook. She chairs the Artist and Advisory Committee and really helps put all of this together and make it success. So thank you to her, and thank you to Molly O'Leary, who makes this event actually take place. So thank you wherever she's running around making sure something's perfect back there in the corner. No more ado, Helen, I'll let you introduce Sanford.
Hi, everyone. Let's do it again. Hi, everybody. Woo!
You know what? I got a better idea. How about we do this? We did this a little earlier today.
Okay, here we go.
Those of you who are with us know how this works.
Okay.
Those of you who weren't, remember the wave. You remember the wave that used to happen at those big stadiums? We're going to do that now and loosen up the crowd. We're going to start on this side. We're going to start in the wave and go back. Then it's going to go to that side and come forward back to us.
Oh, now that's some complicated spatial activity right there.
They can handle it. I know
Front
they can.
row? Are
you guys
we ready?
Okay.
Wave.
Go.
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
Beautiful.
That's
Beautiful.
up.
Beautiful. Oh, my goodness. Yes.
All right. All right.
Welcome to Snowmass. Hi, everybody. This is my first, well, it's so many firsts for me. It's my first summer series interview. It's my first time interviewing Sanford in public. We've had many opportunities over the course of the past decade or so to meet and chat, and I've always had my eye on the work and have followed the work really since I think I first started knowing of your work. But you can do things in public that you can't do in private. And I love exploiting this moment. So what we're going to do is I am going to ask Sanford 4 questions, and he doesn't know what they are. And then we're going to talk about 4 works of art. But he knows what the 4 works of art are, largely because he made them. And that seems only fair. It's not a test. But Sanford is an artist who, really came up in the 90s and 2000s. And he went to Morehouse College and the Maryland Institute of Art and the Art Institute of Chicago and Skowhegan. And he has shown all over the country and often, in many places all over the world. He is the recent recipient of the Rome Prize. He was at the American Academy in Rome for a year. He's a world traveler, which is something about his work that interests me deeply. And he shows here at the Baldwin Gallery in Aspen and also at Marion Boesky in her Aspen space and her New York space. He is a native Los Angelino who currently lives in New York City, and as a native New Yorker who currently lives in LA, I basically start every social encounter with Sanford with the following question: when are y'all moving out west? So, but one of the things that I wanted to ask you, this is question number 1. Most artists haven't gone to a historically black college. Mm-hmm. And you are a Morehouse man. And I would like to know a couple of things about that. One, what that education was like for you, and how that education allowed you in some way, shape, or form to become an artist.
Wow. I can honestly say in my entire career, this is the first time anyone has ever asked me that. And ever really, yeah, and understood that that is an anomaly in our field.
It is.
Okay, so I went to college at Morehouse College in Atlanta in 1988. And in 1988, there was a resurgence of an Afrocentric frame of mind. Spike Lee had started his first couple of films. School Days had come out. School Days was filmed at Morehouse. Spike Lee went to Morehouse, as well as Martin Luther King and Julian Bond and several other very important African-American luminaries. So there was an interest already right there. I have an older brother and sister. My brother went to Berkeley, my sister went to Harvard. So by the time it was my turn to go to college, I was determined not to follow in either of their footsteps. And with this resurgence of Afrocentricity, I had to look back at my mother and father, who only could go to black colleges because it was very difficult, if ever, for them to be admitted into a non-black college.
Right.
And they turned out pretty good.
I've met Mr. Biggers once, and I can tell you the apple and the tree are close.
Yeah. So, I mean, just as an example, my father was the first black neurosurgeon in Los Angeles. And that's coming from the Jim Crow South.
Right.
And the fortitude it would take to do that, I always have a great admiration for, because I consider that like wanting to be an astronaut, to consider yourself to be able to work on brains coming from a Jim Crow South, where when you graduate from the top of your medical school, they won't allow you to walk through the front door to receive your diploma. So that's my upbringing.
Right.
So at that point, you know, coming out of high school, I was like, I'm going to an all-black college, because my sister and brother are at these other schools, and they're looking at me saying, you know what, it's actually a good idea, because more than likely if you go to another school afterwards, it won't be an all-black school. So here's a 4-year opportunity to build a serious network and a group with a group of other like-minded African Americans to then go and, you know, carry that network and those agenda as you move on for the rest of your life. So that was one of the reasons. And then I went and did a school visit, and it was so off the hook that I was like, I'm definitely going to this school, and that was that. So interestingly enough, my wife, Arena, also went to a historically black college, Howard University in Washington, D.C., which Kamala Harris went to, in fact, didn't she? Yeah, and many other luminaries and so on and so forth. So there's a great tradition there. Now, the interesting part of that is they obviously did not appreciate art at all.
I know this.
They were like pre-med, business, law, everything that's going to get you in the system and make you some money and give you some political clout.
Right.
Art does not count.
Right.
So I took all my art classes at our sister school, which is called Spelman College, which is also a very well-known place. I took art courses there, and I was so into my courses that one of my instructors started putting me in art contests outside of the school system. So my sophomore year, I was in a competition with other grad students in the Atlanta area, and I won second place as an undergrad amongst grads, and I was the only black participant in that contest.
Oh, wow. That must have been huge for
It was
you.
a huge thing for me.
Yeah.
And so the newspapers came to take pictures, and the piece I did was this chrome metal piece that was on the wall, and there was a rusty chain that came off of it that had all kinds of thatch and mud and tar on it, and it wrapped around an old Georgia state flag, which had the Confederate flag in it, as you all remember, I'm sure, because that was, you know, the Confederate flag was incorporated in the actual flag for many, many years.
Right.
And so they came to take pictures, but when they saw the flag, they said, we only want to take the picture of the top of the sculpture with you in it. So I stood in front of the whole thing and said, if you don't get the whole piece, you don't get any of it. And that, to me, taught me a ton. Yeah. So I was, I think I was 19. I learned a lot from that experience. Yeah.
Wow, that's great. Thank you for sharing that story with us. I think it's going to feed into some of the things we talk about when we look at some of your work. The other thing from your biography that has always stood out for me, in addition to the unusualness of you going to an HBC, is that you spent several years in Japan. And I personally am obsessed with Japan. And one of the things that I love about being in Japan is one of those places where you get there and you realize, like, oh, I get what culture is. It really could be totally different. Like the way we do things, you can do them absolutely differently. And so I'm fascinated if you could just talk a little bit about what those post-college years in Japan, what do they give you that then moves out into the work?
So when I was in undergrad, I spent a year living in Florence, studying art and studying Italian. And I got the travel bug. So by the time I graduated, I was looking for opportunities to get back out. And a friend of mine told me about the JET program, Japanese Exchange in Teaching. I'm sure some of you know about it, but it's been around at this point for probably close to 40 years. And it was native speakers from the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, that were then invited to Japan and integrated in the Japanese school system to team teach English with Japanese instructors. So the prerequisites were to not speak Japanese and to be able to deal with the culture shock of being there long enough to then, participate in these classes and so on. So
Wow.
I stayed there for 3 years.
Amazing.
And I think the thing that really attracted me to it was that it literally was a totally different way of living.
Right.
And it was very modern. In fact, it was hyper modern in some ways. But then the other side of it was totally based and steeped in cultural traditions. And that was living in tandem right in front of me every day. And I thought it was amazing. There was like deference for elders, and there was walking through the Shinto shrines and bathing yourself in incense on your way to get into your cherry apple red Mercedes-Benz with the steering wheel on the opposite side and a TV.
Right.
And this is 1992, 93. So it was
Right.
eons before we had many of these technological things, on an everyday basis here. So that was a huge thing. The culture shock there was massive, but not in the way that you might predict. Anyone who is not Japanese will feel the culture shock there because it's a homogeneous society. So for me, that was a great equalizer. So me and my colleagues from different parts of the world, white, black, brown, whatever they were on a very neutral terrain. And over the course of a year, I started speaking Japanese pretty well. And other friends of mine didn't speak so much, but they were learning all the kanji, and they'd have contests in the office of who knew how many characters, but we'd get out on the street, they couldn't say a word. And they were shocked, and they felt discriminated against, like, we can't go into this place because we're not Japanese, and how can you believe they would do this to us? And I'm like, and then I'd speak Japanese and walk right in and be like, got to do your work. So I found that to be very interesting. But beyond that, I got really steeped into Buddhism, going and meditating and learning more about the religion, but also the spirituality, but also how that was present, once again, in this culture that didn't have to talk about it.
Right.
It was just sort of inherent.
Right.
And, it taught me a lot about subtlety and humility and quietude and all of those things that we do not necessarily honor in the West. So I had a harder culture shock moving back to the U.S. after 3 years of being there than going there in the first place.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And, you can see vestiges of that experience in my work, and in my attire, in the quilts that we'll show, and some of the patterns. So a lot of that's there, and even some of the philosophies are still embedded in my working process.
That's a great segue. We'll talk about one of the pieces now before I ask you my other questions. So this is a work by Sanford called Lotus. And Sanford, I believe this is like 8 or 10 feet in diameter. This is a very large object. And I've given you guys also like a detail here. So this is etched glass that is suspended from the ceiling in this large steel armature. And you can see if you guys go online later tonight, you can see there are some photos on Sanford's website of people hand etching these figures, which come from a British, how would you call it, British ship manual?
Slaver's manual.
Yeah,
basically.
slaver's manual that showed the ways in which Africans who had been stolen from their towns and villages on the west coast of Africa were then carried across the ocean in what is often referred to as the Middle Passage. And this becomes a very famous diagram because it's a diagram that's used ultimately by abolitionists to begin the conversation about the termination of slavery, because this is clearly an inhuman situation. So I wonder if you could just talk about this piece. It seems like a merging of Morehouse and the years in Japan.
Yeah, it's a bit of Morehouse, a bit of the years in Japan, and a little bit of sci-fi. Because as I was thinking of it, I was like, this is a portal to another dimension. But it was also basically the dichotomy of sort of triumph over tribulation. And you all know, it's called lotus. So a lotus grows from the muck and mire of a muddy bank, and then grows up into the top of the water, and then it blossoms into this beautiful flower. And I was looking at the experience of African Americans here, and how that started from the muck and the mire, and how that has the potential to grow into this blossom, this lotus blossom. Lotus is also the symbol of peace and wholeness and being complete. So yeah, as you can see, there's over 6,000 figures that are carved into this piece. And I worked with a team of 4 or 5 other people for over a month to carve all those in. And we had to do it that way because they were too small to actually do with any type of computer processes. So this was actually a handmade object. And it is, shown in the round, so as people walk around it, you could see others through the glass. And in my way, that was a way of sort of saying that the slave experience is not relegated to African Americans. This is American history. This is our story collectively, regardless of what side of it you find yourself on. It is part of our collective history. And you can see that as everyone's implied by walking through and being seduced to get closer and then finding the horrific sort of graphic that's right there. But it's also conceptually something that I've been dealing with through a lot of my work is the dichotomy of, something, seduction and then repulsion, but also how icons and symbols are malleable and they change meaning over time, which is something very relevant today as we're seeing history literally be reformed and, used as a tool for whatever purposes someone may have in mind. So by taking this that was once a how-to manual of how to best pack bodies into a ship to get them across the ocean to make some money, then to be repurposed to be used as an anti-slavery propaganda campaign for the abolitionists, and then for me to take it to this transcendent place. It's almost like taking a jazz standard and putting your spin on it. So this is sort of my approach at taking that symbol and taking it through another conceptual reading.
Right. And it has, in your work, it appears, it comes in different forms. So it's a form, both the lotus and the diagram is a form you've returned to. And the question I have, because I know your interest in Buddhism, and I know that the lotus, and you've used the mandala before. So within Buddhism, I understand these to be devices to help with meditation. And I was really curious about what it was like to meditate on this diagram, to literally remake it and to be involved in the 6,000 repetitions of this figure. Like, where does that take you? It feels slightly overwhelming to me.
Well, it's sort of funny, as you say that, the carving of the 6,000 was a very small amount of time. I consider, if you're really deep into meditation, there's seated meditation, but then there's walking meditation, living meditation, eating meditation. To be in a true meditative state, it's not like hitting a button and then going into meditation. That meditation permeates your existence and everything you do.
Right.
With that being said, I've literally been living through the vestiges of this my entire life. So I'm already in that state.
Right.
So this was a way of making that into sort of an icon that I use in various forms because we still haven't got past that.
Right.
So you can look at it as a never forget type of emblem, or you can look at it as a reminder of the work that we all sort of have to do
Right.
in understanding and dealing with our collective American history. So that's why it reappears.
That's really beautiful. You are not someone who shies away from heavily freighted objects that have lots of meaning. Let's just put that out there.
A blessing
You are
and a
not
curse.
someone who begins with a blank canvas and a tube of paint and says, what kind of picture will I make today? You kind of go for the jugular, right? Because trees in African American culture are an extremely loaded situation. They almost always immediately evoke the history of lynching. But you make very beautiful things out of very ugly histories. And I wondered if you could talk about this sort of extraordinary installation that has this incredible, on the one hand violent and on the other hand tender mashup of a piano and a tree.
Well, we all remember that the Buddha found enlightenment underneath a tree as well. And the tree also is the axis mundi that connects, the center of the earth to the heavens and everything in between. So once again, the tree is fraught with so many different readings, and I wanted to conflate many of them with this piece. The piece is called Blossom, and the piano that you see is being uprooted by this tree growing right through it. And there is actually an audio component. So when you walk into this, the keys start moving, and it starts to play my version of Billie Holiday and Abe Mirapul's Strange Fruit, which is about black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Those are the lyrics, obviously. And this was inspired by an incident that happened in Louisiana called the Gina 6 incident. And this was 2008 or 2009 in the small town in Louisiana at a relatively integrated high school. There was a tree where all the white kids would hang out. And one day a black student wanted to go sit under the tree, so he asked one of the teachers, can I sit under that tree? And the teacher's like, why would you even ask that? Of course, go sit under the tree. And as the student did that, gradually the white kids left, and the next day when everyone came back to school, there were nooses hanging from the tree.
And what year was this?
2008, 2009?
There you go.
Yeah. So, again, recurring themes, obviously. And that started to expand into all of these racially motivated events in that town, which culminated one day when a group of black students were walking into a corner store and a group of white students were leaving, and they got into a bit of a scuffle. The white kids pulled out a gun, black kids beat them up and took the gun. The cops came and arrested all the black kids because they stole the gun. And so then there was outrage, and then people started to descend on the town, and all the press were there, and it was a huge blow up. So this was inspired by that notion and how the tree, once again, in history, is the site of so much contention in the South. And this body right here basically is symbolized by the piano. The body is the piano, and the piano is singing out this sort of elegy through the song Strange Fruit. And the tipped over piano stool, of course, is if someone were actually lynched from that tree, they'd be put up on a platform, which would then be kicked from under them. So it is very tender. When you see it, it is sort of a beautiful meditative piece. But when you know all these other layers of the history, you start to see that there's this allegory behind it. And most of my work functions that way.
Right.
I don't mind if somebody deals with the surface. I make the surfaces to seduce. That's what I do as a maker. But when you peel at least one layer back, there's another story. The more layers you pull, the more stories there are. So keep that in mind when looking at my work. It's never just face value.
And I believe, if I'm correct, Sean, right, we have a clip to play. If I do that,
Yep, it should just start playing.
should it start playing?
Or do you have to hit a play button? Let's see.
You're the artist.
Let's see, there might be.
There we go. I wanted you guys to hear some of this. I think one of the things I've always admired about your work is its emotional complexity, right? So that music hits your heart in the most, it's such a tenderness there. And I think that tenderness is really mirrored in how those two objects come together. And there's something, I don't know, you have a very gentle touch, and I'm very interested in that because you take up lots of space, and I'm wondering, like, how do you think about that? Is that just in your flow and that's what you do, or is that something that you're consciously working on?
I do like the work to be able to modulate. And if you look over the expanse of my career, you do see these sort of almost monumental pieces, and then you start to see things that are become even smaller and more diminutive and tender. I like to play the opposites too. It's about tone for me. Not a one-note thing, but the complexity of those tones and the nuances that you can get in the reading of a piece. And, we're talking about some pretty heavy stuff, but I look at it, I don't want to oversimplify things, but to say this is about hate and love and racism and all that, to me is almost overly simplifying the thing.
Right.
We're talking about a long-term dysfunctional relationship. And those, as you know, because everyone has some dysfunctional relationships in their life, those take tenderness and sensitivity.
Right.
And that's how I approach the work.
Right. So, speaking of long-term relationships, here's my third question. When women who are artists have children, everyone wants to know what the impact of that child and motherhood is on their work. And in my experience, it turns out that men are rarely asked that question. But you and your wife have recently had a baby. You have a 21-month-year-old child. You have decided, thank you very much, to bring new life onto the planet. How has that changed what it means for you to be an artist?
Honestly, I'm still trying to figure that out. And I get the sense that that's an ongoing process. It has definitely changed my workflow because I've been an all-consumed type of producer. Even when I was teaching, the minute I leave the classroom, I'm in the studio into the wee hours of the night. And now I'm having to change that workflow. And it's making me make quicker and probably more direct decisions. I no longer can stare at the wall for 8 hours.
Right.
Now I actually have to do something in like 2 hours and make it happen.
Right.
So that's probably helpful. And like I say, it's a work in progress. So I can only imagine the impact that must have on a woman when she has to incorporate all of those things that take up so much, even on a biological level.
Right.
I mean, what I'm trying to deal with to get through it is nothing compared to that.
Right.
But it does affect me too. So yeah, that is a valid question that you should ask all male artists, because I'd like some guidance. So
one of the things I have not had children, but one of the things I know that everyone who does have children say is that you didn't know you had that love in you, like that. And I do believe our capacity for love is infinite. And I'm curious what being cracked open and having all this kind of epic love now in your life, what does that do to the work? Because art and love they're very, very intertwined.
I do find myself wanting to experiment more and be more free, and to, I watch the confidence and the curiosity of my daughter, and I want that. I don't want to be so over-determined in what I'm doing, because a lot of this takes so much work.
Right.
And my hands do a lot by themselves too before my mind gets to it. And now I'm like, you've done all this work. This is sort of the front loading, the charging of the work. Now you can rely on your hands and trust your hands to do the rest. Just as I, watch my daughter trust her hands to just figure it all out.
Right.
And the love thing, yes, I thought I loved my daughter a month ago. And then like 2 weeks ago, she started doing some new stuff. I'm like, oh my God, she's amazing. So once again, I imagine that keeps going and going and going. It's.
I think it stops around 16.
Yeah, right.
I think there's a love hiatus like from 16 to 19.
Yeah, college tuition might be doing that a bit too, I imagine. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad to have you talk about that because it is something I've been thinking a lot about in relationship to your work. And one of the reasons I've been thinking about it is because of this body of work that you've been making. And if I get this wrong, you tell me, right? So it's my understanding, like, you collect African sculpture, and you know that a lot of what you are buying is basically made for a tourist trade, and you're buying it anyway. Even the works that are made for the tourist trade are still made with some kind of energy or mana, or sense that these objects have a rich spiritual dimension, that they are useful, right? And you started dipping them in wax, is that right? And then you decided to do this with them. I think if I press, is this the play? So you take the objects to a shooting range. I watched your TED Talk. You can't shoot them yourself. You have someone else shoot them. And then they end up being cast in bronze. So you've taken this African sculpture and you have put it through many permutations. And it ends up as this kind of sculpture that has, as I understand these images, both a scale like this and then also a monumental scale. And I'd like you to just talk a little bit about these works.
Well, they're very complicated. They're very charged, obviously, and they came out of a almost gut reaction to specifically the killing of Michael Brown. It wasn't Trayvon Martin.
Right.
Eric Garner almost did it, but it was Michael Brown that finally did it. I had been collecting these figures for years, and I never did anything with them because they already have so much mana and juju and aura about them that I just sort of have them there as inspiration. But I was living in Berlin, and I woke up to yet another morning of somebody being killed by the cops, and looking at the footage, and I was like, you know what? I know what I'm going to do with these figures now. And it was a very violent thing on a creative level to then take these figures and then shoot them, but I felt like that was the only way to sort of express what was going on. And for those of you who know about power objects, the reason they have power is because they've been handled and they've been venerated and they've been given such deference that they accumulate that type of power. I started to look at my process of dipping them in wax to sort of make them less identifiable, taking them to the shooting range and sculpting them with 22s and 12-gauge shotguns and 48s and different caliber weapons, and considering that part of that process, doing all these actions, all this care, all this violence, picking up each piece after it was shot, casting that in bronze, and then presenting it. To me, that was adding a whole nother layer, or several other layers of some weird type of veneration, destruction, reconstitution.
Right.
And then showing these as monuments and memorials for those individuals who were killed. So at this point, I've probably done close to 14 or 15 of these figures. And we all know I could do these every day forever because this phenomenon has been going on for 400 years. We only recently had the cell technology to see it happen, but this is part of our American history. So these works operate on that level, but you see the very large one right there, and this is where context becomes very important. The large one that you see on the right is at the Equal Justice Initiative, the EJI Legacy Museum and Memorial down in Montgomery, Alabama. And this was a museum that just opened a year ago, created by the lawyer Brian Stevenson, who's been running the Equal Justice Initiative for 20 years, which has gotten over 150 people off of death row, people who are going to be killed for offenses as minor as stealing a bicycle because of just the way that the system works down there. And he commissioned me to do this piece, which is now sort of the punctuation mark as you leave his museum. You see this very large piece as you walk back out on the street. And as you can see in the image right there, let's see, how does this work? There's the monitor right here that shows that video that you saw. So each of these has a corresponding video that's shot at very high speed, and then I can slow that down, and you can literally see the bullets piercing the figures. But you know, on an art historical level, this is also sort of my addendum of classic sculpture, going back to the classic forms and going through what I consider a transmogrification or transubstantiation of material to create these objects.
I'm amazed when I saw this one in particular. For me, the mashup was the kuros, which is this sort of classic Greek form that really, in many ways, sort of starts us off thinking about the figure in the Western tradition, and Emmett Till, and the picture that Mamie Till allows to go public. And I was curious, did you know that was going to happen?
No.
No.
No, that's another reason I don't pull the trigger, because there's a mana juju situation there. But there's also, I don't want to have control over every single aspect of this.
Interesting.
I want there to be the randomness.
Right.
The videos are quick because the experience is quick. That was like something like 12 shots. That
Right.
video is like 15 seconds.
Right.
You know, when these things occur, they happen at the blink of an eye, but everybody's lives are changed. A very interesting thing about this, there's literally an exhibition of a compilation of these and a few quilt paintings and other works that is traveling right now. It started at St. Louis Museum, at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, and now is at the Chazin Museum, and then going to Tufts in the fall. But when I show this in St. Louis, this piece right here is called For Michael Brown. I did not want to show this at that museum because this is basically ground zero to
Right.
the major protests that happened. And I tried for a year to reach out to his mother because I wanted to talk to her and see how she felt about this. And if I got clearance from her, then I would put this into the show. The other figures I used in that show, those mothers had already come out saying that they want that image, they want that history to be out there. They don't want people to forget about their baby and so on.
Right.
But I didn't hear those words from her. And when I was doing my presentation, a talk very much like this, prior to the opening of the show, she came in.
Oh, wow.
And I knew who she was, so I gave her a shout out from the podium. And immediately after speaking, I made a beeline to her and started talking to her and said, I have made one of these figures for your son. And I wanted to talk to you and let you understand this project before bringing that here to St. Louis. And she's, she had a tear in her eye basically. And she was like, I'm very pleased that you would consider that. I didn't know that you made one for my son, but I do appreciate you talking to me about this before just putting it out there. And I would love for that piece to come. So this was a nimble curatorial staff because we made calls and arranged for that piece to then join that exhibition a few weeks later. So for me, that was like a curatorial and exhibition victory to let the exhibition breathe in the sense that it can change in response to the community that it serves.
Right.
So that was a sort of high point for that work for me.
It prompts two questions in me that I'd like to ask you, both of which take us in some ways away from the specificity of Michael Brown and his murder. But I know that you are always seeking to place these objects in the widest possible field. We can talk about them. So my two questions are, one is about randomness and chance. I know you to be a student of Buddhism. I know John Cage to be a student of Buddhism. I understand John Cage's one of the great gifts that Cage gives American art is the idea that chance is part of this process. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about the role chance plays, especially when you are working with objects that have such laden built-in meanings, meanings that have, are hundreds of years old, and then you are flirting around with chance.
Well, I think Cage is a perfect reference point. I also, to continue with the musical reference, think of jazz improvisation, and the idea that you start with a standard form and then you deviate and improvise and sort of push those musical themes in different directions right there on the spot. I consider history, the history of materials, as well as just sort of art and cultural history, to also be elements in the work. I know this work means one thing today, it can mean something totally different 10 years from now.
Right.
I can't control that, but I do leave space for that to happen.
Right.
I think we might look at some other works that, I'm working on with antique quilts, and I cannot control the materials and how they flow on every quilt, because every quilt is made of hundreds of different types of fabric in the first place.
Right.
So any one material will operate differently on any different patch. So there are all these sort of alchemical elements that are at play beyond just imagery and the initial idea that I have bringing into the work. And I welcome that. That's part of that Buddha mind, is knowing
Right.
that you don't control it all and that there are no mistakes.
Do you ever, in the using chance as a process, do you ever get something you don't like and you kind of have to sit with it?
Often.
Right.
Yes, definitely.
Do you ever push out something that you don't like because because there's the not liking has a whole other modality?
Yeah, there's some things I just can't let out in the world. So, you know, sometimes you have to turn the canvas over and make it face the wall, like Picasso did it with Demoiselle.
Demoiselle d'Avignon.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Yes,
But Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon has come. I've been here since. It's Wednesday. It came up in class on Monday. Rashid Johnson did a performance about it last night at the museum on Tuesday, and it just hit the table today.
well, I knew about the other two, so
Oh, yeah,
I figured
okay.
I'd tie that in.
All right, so you're all right. Because
I'm
was
improvising
just like,
here. I'm improvising. You know?
I was like, damn, I got to do a Picasso situation. How'd this happen? Okay. Oh, here's my other question about this. How do you think being a parent is going to affect how you do your work like this now? Like, you made this, I'm assuming, before you were a parent.
Well, my answer today is that I would continue to do this work and just educate my daughter as much as possible about this, because this is about real stuff.
Right.
It's not as abstract as it may appear. It is not from an abstract place.
That's right.
And the sooner she knows that these are the realities of the country she lives in, the better equipped she is to deal with it.
Right. Oh. So you recently had a show in New York. I think I saw you in the street, and I was so excited. I was so excited that Sanford had a show at Marion Boesky. I was in New York from LA, and I went into the gallery, and it was one of those shows where I texted my wife. I was like, I'm in Sanford's show, and it is amazing. It felt like I was so happy. And I know pride is one of the 7 sins, so I try not to feel proud, but I was weirdly proud of you because it felt like such a breakout show. And one of the things that really did grab me were these extraordinary quilts that you've been working with. And I wonder if you just want to talk us through a little bit about these quilts.
Yeah, so around 2007 or 2008, I was asked to be in a show in Philadelphia to basically give attention to places in the city that had gone into disrepair and had been forgotten by the collective memory, the cultural memory of the town. So I worked at the Mother Bethel Church, which was the first black-owned, or at least documented black-owned piece of real estate in the U.S., but it was also a place that harbored slaves on the Underground Railroad as they were escaping up north. And many of you may know Philadelphia itself was a major hub for the Underground Railroad, because once you got there, you had so many more options. There was a huge abolitionist presence, and there was, systems in place to get you out. So that was basically Mecca in that sense. So I was working in the church, and there was all these stained glass windows, and I was going to do something in stained glass, but I happened upon an exhibition of some antique quilts, and I was looking at them, and I was like, wait a second. You've got these geometric patterns and color and so on, so you have some similar motifs between the quilts and the stained glass, but the added interest for me was that stained glass was considered this sort of, heroic, male-dominated sort of, religious, heroic is probably the best word, art form, and quilts being relegated to quote-unquote women's work and the domestic and soft and nostalgia. And I thought that they were as interesting, if not more interesting, than some of the stained glass. And I recall the G's Bend quilt exhibition at the Whitney, which was a groundbreaking show showing these quilts made by these African-American women in the Whitney, which was positing it against, sort of the history of modernist painting. And it held its ground. In fact, it was the most inspiring painting that I'd seen since I started painting. And I stopped painting in grad school for around 20 years until I saw that show, and I was like, oh, that's cool. So I started to do a lot more research, and I started to pick up antique quilts from yard sales, from eBay, from donations, and started to paint on them. Because one of the stories behind quilts is there's been a battle between historians of whether quilts were used as signposts on the Underground Railroad. So as escaping slaves would come to a safe house, if there was a quilt of a certain pattern, or folded a certain way, or presented a certain way, it implied that the safe house was open for business, or that the cops were watching, so you have to keep moving, or even directions, follow the North Star, and travel 5 miles and make a turn, that kind of thing. And whether it's true or not, for me, that vernacular history was interesting enough to start the project and consider myself a late collaborator, working with these original artisans and adding extra code directly onto the quilts. And also, I did tell some people today I did start my artistic career as a graffiti artist in LA. So the idea of quote unquote defacing something is sort of in my bones. So I like once again, that dichotomy of whether I am defacing these or if I am embellishing these. Also, let's get back to hip hop, that these are samples. These were forgotten tunes and songs that nobody was singing until they were reintroduced into the popular discourse by a DJ or a producer who's taking snippets, cutting, pasting, collaging, and making a new work. And that's essentially what's happening on a material level with these. So on any given quilt, I'm working with spray paint, acrylic, oil stick, various antique quilts, kimonos, indigo from Japan, tar, glitter, you name it. So really, they can hold everything. Mm-hmm. And they imply sculpture and the figure to me because the primary purpose of all of them was to hold and comfort bodies. So I find all of that to be embedded in this. So the one on the right is probably the size of a king-size bed or so, and you can see on the far right quadrant of it, there's this sort of blue and white textile. That's actually a deconstructed kimono. And the one on the far right is all done on an antique Japanese futon cover. So that's all dyed indigo and then various textiles placed upon it. And the figure in the center is also a deconstructed kimono. And the one on the far right is called Beloved, which was basically inspired by Toni Morrison and the book Beloved. And the one on the left is Every Day a Sunset Dies.
One of the things I loved about, when I was talking about this yesterday with some of the board members at the ranch, that my experience organizing Black Mountain College really changed my idea about the words art and craft. And one of the things I love about these quilts is the way they kind of are, they just like won't play with that dichotomy. They're just like, oh yeah, that's not, like non-operative. And you just pushed this historical craft material and basically let it behave like a painting, which it was kind of already doing, but you're taking it to another level. And I'm just curious about your relationship to these. I know you can sometimes be called a conceptual artist, but you are also someone who works deeply with their hands, and you have a lot of hand skill. And I wonder if you just talk a little bit about that for a minute.
Yeah, one of the things I hated the most in grad school was on the literal first day of classes, one of the instructors saying that there is no such thing as political art and that art can't be political. And I thought to myself, all art is political, whether it wants to be political or not. And we can argue that back and forth, and that's fine, and it should be argued. But with that being said, I find that there's politics in the gesture, politics in the material, and so on. And one of those debates in there was the arts and craft conversation, and where the twain, never the twain shall meet type of situation. But there are artists who have been doing that so well for so long. I think of Martin Poirier, of course, who somehow sidestepped that whole conversation because the craft was so high and the art was so high.
Right.
And I've always been a champion of the quote-unquote underdog, even in art forms. So I look at pattern and design and op art and all these movements that had a brief moment of shine and then were forgotten. And there's no mistake that those movements were largely, or they had a very large female presence. And they did not stand the test of time as abstract expressionism and minimalism and so on that were considered to be more male-dominated forms. So that's always in my work. It's also sort of the idea, once again, of jazz and hip-hop, taking the remains, taking the discarded and turning that into something that is substantial. So that's where the conceptual impetus is. But to do honor to the actual crafts people who made these pieces, I put a significant amount of work and craft back into them.
Right.
Yeah, that's deference to the creators.
That's beautiful. All right, here's my fourth and final question. We live in this amazing country called the United States of America, and it is founded on a dream. And that dream usually takes the form of the word freedom. And I would like to know what freedom means to you.
My most aspirational definition for that would be simply the freedom of fear. I think that would be true freedom.
To be free from fear.
There are other freedoms, of course. I think the freedom of fear is pretty high on my list. For all of us to be all of us and not fear for being who we are.
Right.
And whatever form that shapes. And that really amounts to a mutual respect. And I find that sometimes we lack that. And a lot of it is propaganda, and a lot of it is not having enough exposure. So I think to attain that freedom, you have to expose yourself. It takes work. It's not given to you.
Right.
You have to work for that. And if we all want that, we have to work for that.
Right. That's really beautiful. Thank you. I believe we have 8 minutes left. And so Sean, if you wouldn't mind turning up the house lights, and we can probably squeeze in a couple of questions from the audience if people would like to say something. I see somebody back there, and if you wouldn't mind taking the microphone so that we can capture you on the tape and everyone can hear you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nancy. I happen to be an art quilter, and I saw one of your exhibits in Miami, where I live, and you had them hung randomly. Can you tell us about how you went to the random rather than looking at this, which is flat, and you did a beautiful job of hanging them.
Oh, so you mean how they were off the wall a bit, or?
They were off the wall and they were hung almost like on nails.
Right. So yeah, the way you're seeing these represented now obviously is very two-dimensional and flat. But if you were to see these in person, they are all hanging on these very simple cleat systems. So they are projecting off the wall an inch or two and hanging. So they're like tapestries. They have drop shadows from being suspended from the wall, and they have much more of an airy feel. So they become more sculptural and feels like an installation.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Hi, Sanford.
Hi.
So we were hoping maybe you could talk about the new medium that you've taken on recently.
Right. So there will be a show at Baldwin Gallery later this month. And there will be 3 new pieces there that are marble works. So I mentioned that we were in Rome for the last year at the American Academy. And while I was there, I decided to go back into the classics and start mining from, the canonical works of from Italy and Greco-Roman, the Greco-Roman period. And many of you may or may not know this, but the marbles that we have come to know of as the classical monochromatic white marbles were often polychromatic marbles that were painted with various pigments and various colors that over the years through weathering or sometimes different rulers coming in and decapitating and wrecking previous sculptures, the paint has been removed, so now they become monochromatic. And there's, scientists out there right now who are doing tests to see exactly what pigments may have been used on which figures. And I thought that was very interesting because there's a parallel to that when you talk about African sculpture. And when African sculpture was sort of popularized at the turn of the 20th century in Europe, it was largely through a book and an exhibition by Carl Einstein called Negroplastique. And those wooden pictures, the ones that we all know of these sort of stark black or brown wooden figures, that wasn't the case either. Those figures had raffia and beads and colored elements on them as well. So you have whitewashing happening in Europe, and you have blackwashing happening, from these African works. So the way we know sculpture is a myth. So taking those myths and conflating them, taking those marble works, and the works you'll see are combinations. I call them chimeras. And they're figures that are derived from Greco-Roman figurative sculptures, but the faces and heads are replaced with African masks and African heads and so on. And those African objects were also influenced by the tourist trade. These are what they call contemporary traditional works. So they aren't the works that you know as the canonical works from various societies, but these are the works to satisfy the European market that wanted to see the stark, black, wooden objects. So they are authentic African sculptures, but they are not the traditional African sculptures. So in my opinion, that ends up being sort of the earliest example that I know of real postmodernism. This is pre-Duchampian postmodernism. This is the appropriation and reappropriation of objects. So with that in mind, I've created a body of sculptures that are combining those, and these are mashups. I derive and design these mostly on computer, and when they're made, I keep those computer glitches and odd spots in the final pieces as well, sort of to show the authenticity of what we consider to be these great heroic histories and stories, the sort of malleability of history itself.
Beautiful. We have time for one more question. Yeah, back there.
Thank you very much for the really great talk. This is super enlightening stuff. I am struck by one of the things that I'm also most interested in, but you touched on it, which is context. And it sounds like that's really important to you in demonstrating your work to people. And I'm mostly wondering about, there's a lot of stuff in here like the piano and the tree, where those layers underneath that start to repulse you. I mean, most people, like me especially, I wouldn't have the context or the information up front, just looking at the work to have that. So how do you usually try to provide that for the reader of your work, or the quilts as well? I mean, is it just kind of the pamphlet stuff, or do you try to use that in the work? And it's also kind of related to accessibility.
I have been experimenting with various strategies over the years. When that piano and tree, when Blossom was shown at the Brooklyn Museum, there was pretty heavy didactics on the walls to explain all of those stories. And I actually was very dissatisfied with that at the end, because it didn't allow the mystery to happen. And some of the early quilts, I even painted in QR codes where you can take a QR picture and then go to a website that had those quilts being used in videos and all these other expanded formats to add those stories. Still not didactic, but providing more information. And I have a performance group. I have a band called Moon Medicine, and when we perform, we add a lot of these elements in the show, and that further informs and further confuses all of this. Once again, I noticed when I said that those marble pieces were polychromatic, there were several people who were like, oh, wow, didn't know that. So here I'm saying this, those works are thousands of years old. So the story sort of is never really that concise that you can just find all the information at once. I'm being optimistic, but I hope that after you start to understand me as an artist and you have a chance to see my work over time, you see the interconnectedness of everything I've done, and I stand by that, from works I made in the 90s to now. So you actually have to read my work. The codex is all there. It's not as simple as putting it in one written form, but you actually have to mind the work itself and understand that there's probably another story to find out. I will always give you the hints, but you have to do the work to do it. And I think that's antithetical to a day where we just Google an answer very quickly. This is the analog format. Yeah.
Sanford, one of the things I love about your work is how complex it is, and the layers and the layers and the layers. And if your audience is half as curious about the world as you are, then it feels like always your work is such a gift. And I want to thank you so much for being here at the Ranch.
Thank you. Thanks.